little different. I don't think I've ever done anything like this before, but I felt real strong this morning that this is what I need to do. Yes, absolutely welcome. We're not going to have a Bible story today. We're going to have a history story. We all know Thanksgiving is this week, and I wanted to tell what the story of Thanksgiving was all about. Okay, there was a group of people in England who felt really strong about how they wanted to worship the Lord. But at that time in history, and still today in many countries, the government tells you how you worship, what religion you're going to be, what denomination, if you're a Christian, which denomination you're going to be, and how you're going to worship. And these people did not agree with their king about what the proper way to worship God was. And the king was throwing them in jail and giving them a really hard time. So they all moved to Holland. Holland had freedom of religion. It was one of the first countries ever to have freedom of religion. But they had trouble getting jobs there, so they were having trouble feeding their families. And their children were being drawn away from their practice of Christianity to their neighbors' practices. And that's not what they wanted. They wanted their children to grow up worshiping the way they thought was the right way to worship. So they went back to England, and they hired a ship, and they set sail for America. And the ship sprung a leak, so they went back to England. So then they hired two more ships. One was, I think, was named the Speedwell, and the second was named the Mayflower. And they set out again, and the Speedwell sprung a leak. So they all got on the Mayflower. Speedwell went back to England, and they went on to America. And they spent weeks out in the ocean. All they could see was water. No matter where they looked, they were overcrowded in the holds. It was stormy, so they were seasick. And even if they weren't seasick, there was a bug going through, some sort of virus. They were all very sick. It was a pretty miserable time. They got to America. And they didn't know exactly where they were going to land. The winds had blown them to the wrong place. The king had given them permission to land over here. They ended up over here. And so they didn't know exactly what they should do. They found a really nice place that looked like it had had a village at one time. But there was nobody living there. So they decided to build their little town there called Plymouth. And they found a cache of corn that was able to keep them alive, plus the supplies they had on their boat. And they arrived there, I believe it was in November that they arrived there. And they made it through the winter. Only half of them died during the winter. And I say only because Jamestown 20 years earlier had 80% of their people die. So 8 out of 10 instead of 5 out of 10 had died in Jamestown. Only 5 out of 10 died in the Pilgrims. It was a really hard time. Springtime came, and they knew how to plant crops in England, but planting in England is different than in America. Their climate is different, the soil's different, there are a lot of differences. One day, an Indian walked into their village. He walked up to the men of the village and he said, "Hi, got any beer?" Which kind of surprised them. It turns out there had been English fishermen up and down the coast, and this man had met the English fishermen, learned English, and learned about beer. The next day, he returned with a friend named Squanto. And Squanto had actually traveled with the fishermen for several years. He knew English quite well. And when he was done traveling with the fishermen, he had returned to that exact place where Plymouth now was, and found out that his entire tribe had died. So he had no family or anything. He had been living with a neighbor tribe. He moved back to Plymouth, and he told the Pilgrims he didn't care for them living there, and he's the only one who had a legal right to the land. He told them they were free to live there, and he helped them. He taught them how to plant in America, how to build good homes in America that could survive the winter. After the whole year went through, and the neighboring tribes would help them too, And they paid back the corn they borrowed from the tribes. And there was a lot of trade going on between the neighboring tribes and the Pilgrims. It came time for harvest. And they harvested more than enough food to get them through the next winter. And they were thankful. They were extremely thankful to God for sending them Squanto, for giving them a village, land where they could farm and they could grow enough, and for blessing their crops so they could grow enough to survive. So they decided to hold a Thanksgiving feast to thank God for everything that he had blessed them with. And they invited the neighboring Indians to come join them in their Thanksgiving feast. And they expected the chief to show up, and one or two of his friends. He came with 30 men. And they momentarily panicked until they realized that the chief had also brought deer and turkey that they had shot. So they brought food, so there was plenty of food for everybody. And they spent 3 days feasting and thanking God and having a party and thanks to God. We don't have enough parties and thanks to God for what he does for us. But they did that for him. That was the first American Thanksgiving. There were many Thanksgivings after that, times when we would win major battles or win wars, or if God would help us through a natural disaster, we would have, usually our president would call a day of Thanksgiving, and we would have a party to thank God for his blessings for us. In 1863, after the North won the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said, you know what, we should have a day of Thanksgiving to thank our God for helping us to win this decisive battle. This means there's a good chance we're going to win the war. And what we should do is we should thank God every year. So Abraham Lincoln proposed and Congress passed that every year on the 4th Thursday of November, we would have a day of Thanksgiving to thank God for all of the blessings that he has given to us. Okay?
Thank you.
So let's sing our song.